Opinion not another 1971 Why India must convert OP Sindoors triumph into long-term strategy. Bharat is gripped by euphoria and an ecstatic moment of glory, accorded to it by its last bastion of diplomacy, Indian armed forces through Operation Sindoor. Typically, when diplomacy fails, options diminish and the share price of the nation drops, or when calamities occur and precious lives need saving, or when an enemy threatens conflict and we need to nip it in the bud like any other nation. Bharat looks up to its scholar warriors in uniform to deliver with unflinching commitment, dedication, and dependability, qualities often rare in most other organizations. This time too, Bharat rides a wave of glory on the back of its military might. For far too long, the rise of bureaucracy craftily keeping the polity close while gradually excluding the armed forces from decisions affecting national power, all the while enhancing the roles and remuneration of themselves and sister organizations like the police, has created a silent pain in the men and women who serve in uniform. From being constantly relegated in the warrant of precedence, to curate and structured organizations initiated by the armed forces being made bereft of military presence, to being served a raw deal on matters of pay and pensions, the acuteness of the ailment has grown to a level where civilian officials have started seeking credit for military operations and now attempt to control them through a lens that will always be shaded and colored. We have witnessed a few wars with Pakistan and China, winning all against Pakistan and losing one against China. That loss came with heavy sacrifices by the armed forces, who were ill-equipped, and the government could not even kit them with the basics at the time. The victories came with their own share of gains, much of which, especially after the 1971 war, was undone as we returned large tracts of land to Pakistan along with their prisoners of war, while ours never came back. Kargil saw the resolute bravery of our armed forces in the most trying terrain conditions, marked by great sacrifice, and yet, besides celebrating that victory, we have left some decisions unaccounted for, with low bureaucratic responsibility and no continuity in political intent. Today, we have made history by crippling Pakistan's will with just 3 days of effective targeting. While the future remains uncertain owing to the irrationality of Pakistan and the support it receives from foreign enemies of Bharat and the deep state that has transformed an ideologically handicapped country into a terror-infused, venomous snake, Bharat feels secure that its armed forces will deliver and its political leadership will take the right decisions. During the preparatory phase of this operation, Prime Minister Modi held consultations with the CDs and the service chiefs together, and on 2 occasions directly and separately with the chiefs of the Indian Air Force, IAF, and Indian Navy. While those meetings were held behind closed doors, one can hypothesize that the outspoken chiefs gave the Prime Minister a clear account of capabilities and deficiencies, so that a prudent decision could be made. That alone would have led to a game plan for precision strikes, with conventional aspects kept on a slight back burner to ensure full preparedness, in case war is thrust upon Bharat. While many lessons have been drawn from the wars and skirmishes Bharat has faced, let us draw conclusions from a different perspective, examining 3 distinct scenarios our nation has undergone to understand where we stand and what we must do. This was a full-fledged war, for which we had to wait and prepare in order to liberate Bangladesh. However, the war began with Pakistan launching airstrikes on our airfields with the commencement of Operation Chenghis Khan. In this war, Bharat was engaged on 2 fronts and had limited air superiority. Since the army chief at the time had requested time to prepare beginning in April 1971 and wanted to avoid launching an offensive during the monsoon season in Bangladesh, the Prime Minister agreed. This decision by the armed forces supported the broader political calculations. An offensive in December also strategically negated the possibility of China opening a front through Tibet. Prior to the war, the Soviet Union had issued warnings to Pakistan. While General Yahya Khan declared a state of emergency on November 23, 1971, the war formally began on December 3, 1971 with a surprise aerial attack on Indian airfields by the Pakistan Air Force. The key strategy was to contain Pakistan and capture Dhaka through a decisive offensive. The United States became involved to limit Soviet influence in the region. At that time, its ally China was also a close partner of Pakistan. The US floated a resolution at the UN Security Council on December 8, 1971 calling for a ceasefire, which was vetoed by the Soviet Union. In this war, the US urged China to mobilize its forces along the border, but China did not oblige. The US did, however, manage to get several Middle Eastern countries to supply weapons to Pakistan. Sri Lanka allowed refueling of Pakistani aircraft during the war. Israel, on the other hand, despite not having diplomatic relations with Bharat at the time, supplied armaments, ammunition, and more. Post-war, the Shimla Agreement was signed. This not only allowed the return of approximately 93,000 prisoners of war to Pakistan but also saw Bharat return more than 13,000 km superscript 2 of land that the Indian Army had seized inside Pakistan. Some of those areas continue to haunt us today, having left our defensive posture weakened in certain sectors. Operation Trident marked the beginning of the naval operations, culminating in the destruction of Karachi port, an emphatic success carried out as part of Operation Python. This total annihilation of Pakistan in 1971 and its dismemberment from East Pakistan to Bangladesh pushed it further toward becoming what is today the terrorist capital of the world. The war was preceded by undetected infiltration by the Pakistan Army and occupation of key terrain from February 1999 onwards, eventually leading to war in May 1999. While the total area seized through the ingress was between 130 and 200 km superscript 2, many formations were withdrawn from the counter-infiltration grid and reserves and brought into the sector. Nearly 30,000 fighting troops were employed to evict the Pakistanis, with more than 500 casualties suffered on our side. Operation Safe Sagar, launched by the IAF, was constrained by the directive not to cross the line of control LOC. A naval blockade under Operation Tulwar was also affected, which severely limited logistics for Pakistan. In terms of international opinion, and given that this unprovoked intrusion came shortly after a meeting between both Prime Ministers, the USA asked Pakistan to act responsibly. The G7, ASEAN, and European Union supported Bharat and criticized Pakistan, while China urged Pakistan to pull back. Media presence was much higher in this war, with electronic media able to reach the front lines, bringing both advantages and disadvantages to the ongoing operations. Both countries had tested nuclear weapons in 1998, and on May 31, 1999, barely a week after Bharat began its military operations, and just 4 days after IAF assets were deployed against Pakistan, the Pakistani foreign minister warned that escalation of the limited conflict could lead Pakistan to use any weapon in its arsenal. Reportedly, U.S. intelligence agencies picked up indications that Pakistan was likely to move its nuclear launch assets forward, prompting the U.S. administration to issue a strong warning not to proceed. The fear generated by a deteriorating military situation, diplomatic isolation on the global stage, and the rising risks of a larger conventional or nuclear war prompted Pakistan to withdraw from the territories of Bharat that it had intruded upon. The Indian stock market rose by 30%. Defense expenditure increased, Pakistan faced deeper isolation, Indo-US relations began to improve, Israel's role as a trusted friend grew in stature, and the NDA government was re-elected in the general elections that followed the war. The war led to a coup in Pakistan. This operation commenced as a retaliation to the terrorist attack on the Parliament of Bharat on December 13, 2001. This attack followed the Kargil War, in which Pakistan was ultimately humiliated, militarily defeated, and geopolitically isolated. The Chief Minister of Jammu and Kashmir at the time was Farooq Abdullah, who urged the government to strike terror camps in Pakistan. Intriguingly, the current Chief Minister during Operation Sindoor is Omar Abdullah, son of Farooq Abdullah. Western media immediately shifted focus to the implications of both countries being nuclear powers and the ongoing U.S. war in Afghanistan. The long mobilization was de-escalated in October 2002. Mechanist forces along the Western Front required 3 to 4 weeks to mobilize. A limited offensive option was considered, focused primarily on Pakistan-occupied Kashmir (POK), to restrict the scope of action and align with the rationale of the U.S. war in Afghanistan, thereby limiting international backlash. While India's war-waging capability was assessed as far superior, Pakistan appeared ill-prepared. By mid-January 2002, then-President Musharraf publicly committed to combating terrorism emanating from within Pakistan's territory. In response, then Prime Minister Vajpayee called off the offensive, and India remained mobilized in a state resembling a ceasefire. However, tensions resurfaced as snow began to melt along the LOC, and in May 2002, suicide attacks were carried out in Kaluchak on a military base and school, killing women, children, and several soldiers. During the intervening period, Pakistan had fortified positions along the LOC, and the feasibility of a limited offensive into POK appeared to be diminished. When an Indian attack seemed imminent, escalating tensions were marked by intense artillery fire in the Jammu region. Pakistan tested nuclear weapons, prompting India to take a decisive step by reviewing its own nuclear preparedness and affirming its ability to strike back. Vajpayee reached out to Russia, the USA, the UK, and France to highlight that Musharraf had not delivered on his January 2002 promises and reiterated that Bharat reserved the right to act. These nations, along with Japan, urged Bharat to exercise restraint. After intense diplomatic engagement, the USA had to read the Riot Act, and the U.S. Secretary of Defense visited Pakistan to extract further assurances from Musharraf, enabling Washington to urge Bharat not to escalate the situation. Following limited action in July and August 2002, the standoff was eventually called off in October, with some tactical and operational gains for Bharat along the LOC. Surprisingly, throughout the wars and skirmishes with Pakistan, the country has consistently managed to craft a notion of victory even when it was purely propaganda at a global scale. This same pattern was evident in the early days of Operation Sindoor as well. With nearly 4 billion spent by Bharat and the lack of strategic surprise due to delayed mobilization, there will always be a need for accountability for an operation that ultimately did not appear to achieve its intended end state, particularly in compelling Pakistan to give up terrorism as an instrument of statecraft. Economic comparison of war skirmishes: the longer the war, the greater the economic drain and the slower the market's ability to recover and exceed projected growth rates. While the market experienced a 30% rebound within a year of the Kargil War, it witnessed a decline during the same period following Operation Parakram. In contrast, smaller skirmishes and terror attacks have led to higher growth. For instance, the surgical strikes after URI and the Balakot strike post-Pulwama achieved over 15% market growth within a year. Similarly, following the Mumbai 2611 attacks, the market surged by nearly 90% in the subsequent year. Global opinion has increasingly shifted in favor of Bharat, driven by its economic potential and structural reforms that have opened markets and boosted manufacturing. The traditional Cold War implications have diminished for Bharat, which now holds 22 strategic partnerships with both Russia and the USA. Its role during the COVID pandemic, the Ukraine war, and the emergence of the China Plus One strategy has strengthened Bharat's global standing. Bharat has also been effective in curbing illicit economic support from the Middle East to Pakistan, while simultaneously cautioning the USA and the West against their historic role in enabling global terrorism via Pakistan. Political dilemmas. Signs of weakness. Political decision-making has always been critical, and while the armed forces have consistently risen to expectations, whether or not fully equipped, the political class has often been seen as overthinking, with visible weakness stemming from timid and risk-averse leadership within North Bloc and South Bloc. This perceived weakness was evident from the delayed response to Pakistani aggression in 1948, which led to the loss of Pak, and later in the 1965 and 1971 wars, where key terrain and prisoners of war were returned to Pakistan, effectively at a 100% concession. The hesitation was even more pronounced during Operation Parakram, where prolonged mobilization occurred without decisive military action, driven instead by a desire to seek global approval. A process that allowed Pakistan to buy time, strengthen its defenses, and deceive the international community and Bharat alike. Funding of Pakistan's Islamist ideology. From the 1960s to 2000, Pakistan received over $70 billion in overseas development assistance (ODA). It has continued to receive funding from traditional partners even after nearly everywhere, including the 2001 mobilization. The USA alone granted Pakistan an average of $2 billion annually from 2002 to 2010, ostensibly to fight terrorism. Other international financial institutions also provided grants and bailouts. Although the Trump administration suspended aid between 2018 and 2022 due to Pakistan's duplicity in Afghanistan, it still provided nearly $400 million in security assistance related to F-16s and other defense equipment. Transparency International and the American Enterprise Institute, among others, have documented how such funds have been misused to promote, train, and execute terror missions, including cross-border attacks. Into Bharat. War on multiple fronts. Traditionally, Bharat has fought wars and gradually but steadily prepared for engagements on two fronts. In the 1971 war, while we fought on the Eastern Front to liberate Bangladesh, the Western Front remained active to contain and degrade Pakistan's war-waging capabilities, albeit in a slow and somewhat uncertain manner. Over time, we have repeatedly assessed our capacity to counter China and sustain a two-front war. This concern became more prominent during the tenure of General V.K. Singh as an army commander, even before he assumed office as Chief of Army Staff. Since the Doklam incident, Bharat has approached the two-front threat with greater clarity and has accelerated preparations, particularly in infrastructure development and seasonal force posturing, focusing on the Western Front during summers and the Northern Front in winters. Today, we find ourselves at a juncture where, in addition to the possibility of an orchestrated grave internal security crisis, we may simultaneously face threats across our western, northern, and eastern borders. Each would present varying degrees of escalation, requiring urgent responses and placing immense stress on paramilitary forces, PMFs, and civil defense organizations. Operations of such complexity and the contingencies that may arise are unprecedented in our history. Even our wargaming exercises remain lackluster, with the polity often lacking a clear understanding of plausible scenarios. Consequently, response mechanisms and actionable plans remain unwritten. The bureaucratic establishment, meanwhile, continues to resist a collaborative planning approach with all stakeholders. This poses a significant risk, as command and control structures will undoubtedly be tested, especially given the hierarchical and often rigid nature of interactions at the apex level. Nuclear is unclear. The nuclear bogey has been carefully retained in strategic and political discourse for nearly 70 years. This single factor has offered politicians and bureaucrats a convenient excuse to limit military action, resulting in a failure to nip terrorism in the bud and allowing it to evolve into a Hydra-head threat with even legitimist liaisons. This has led us into decades of fruitless dialogue, debate, and deferral, even impacting military thinking. Over time, even defense leadership started to believe in the deterrent, but failed to prepare adequately for conflict under its shadow, particularly as bureaucratic inertia curtailed defense spending. A streak of political leadership also emerged that shied away from building and strengthening the armed forces. The exodus of Kashmiri Hindus adds another layer to this issue, pointing to a combination of excessive caution in using force to protect citizens, bureaucratic dereliction, and political complicity. Growing military capacities of Bharat's military prowess, particularly in the domains of air power and naval capability, have undergone a paradigm shift. Simultaneously, there has been a significant boost in missile technologies and satellite-based systems, which have both grown in capacity and capability. The recent devastation of Pakistani military assets during Operation Sindoors has highlighted the emergence of niche technologies, both indigenously developed and through co-development models. Today, both the Indian Air Force and Indian Navy enjoy operational dominance over their Pakistani counterparts, creating a vacuum in Pakistan's military preparedness, as current US and China-supplied weapons and surveillance systems have been found wanting. However, in terms of ground operations capacity, Bharat has yet to transform into a fast, flexible, and lean force capable of sustained operations under a nuclear umbrella. This is a cause for concern, especially now that our economy is well positioned to fund such a transformation. Pakistan's notion of victory Bharat trails in perception warfare throughout its military history. Pakistan, particularly through the ISE, has been highly proactive in curating and disseminating its narrative across diplomatic channels, media, foreign press, think tanks, and international institutions. This has allowed it to project a sense of strength to its largely uninformed domestic population. Bharat, despite having delivered consistent military defeats to Pakistan, has often failed to secure the perception victory. The same pattern repeated in the initial days of Operation Sindoor, when Pakistan's falsehoods and propaganda were amplified not only by its own media, but also by outlets in China and the West whose military systems and intelligence assets underperformed during the conflict. These foreign narratives, instead of acknowledging those failures, lent support to Pakistan's concocted claims. Swipe left for next video to be continued. Colonel Rohit Dev, a second-generation army officer, is an adjunct professor at the Rashtriya Raksha University, a geopolitical analyst and a prime-time TV personality. Views expressed in the above piece are personal and solely those of the author. They do not necessarily reflect NEWS18's views. Latest blogs.